As both sides hunker down in their camps, the gears of strategy are already turning towards the spring thaw. Witness the intense naval arms race on Lake Ontario, where the British and Americans rush to build warships of unprecedented size on the Great Lakes. We'll follow the dramatic British raids on Fort Oswego and Sandy Creek and the devastating consequences that unfolded. But the war isn't just fought on the water. We'll also uncover the fiery destruction of Port Dover and the escalating cycle of retaliation that will leave a permanent scar on the Niagara region. From the icy plains where indigenous nations thrived long before the settlers arrived, to the battle smoke of the War of 1812, Canada's stories echo through time. We know the legends, Vimy Ridge, the birth of Confederation, the Summit Series that stole a nation's heart. But history isn't carved solely from grand moments. In every corner of this vast land, lesser-known tales linger. Forgotten heroes, struggles echoing in local lore, moments that shaped communities but faded from the national stage. This podcast is a journey of rediscovery. I'm no scholar, just a captivated explorer. My goal isn't to lecture, but to ignite. If my tales spark a flicker of curiosity in you, then I've succeeded. So settle in. Adventure awaits in the echoes of time. This is Canadian History with Stephen Wilson. As the British and the Americans settled into winter quarters, as the snow started to fall in January 1814, the plans started for the coming spring. Both sides would want to come out and gain the upper hand early. The Americans spent most of 1813 trying to capitalize on their small victories, but not getting ahead. They managed to capture Fort George, where the Niagara River flows into Lake Ontario, and they did recapture Detroit, as well as make advances into what is now southwestern Ontario. However, they were forced to withdraw from the Canadian side of the Niagara River late in the year, and a campaign to capture Montreal stalled before it truly got started. The British had intended to treat the war as strictly a defensive war, as they lacked the manpower to truly go on the offensive. This was due to the Napoleonic Wars, in particular in the Iberian Peninsula, which demanded troops. There had been a few offensive actions taken: the capture of Detroit at the outset of the war, the capture of Ogdensburg, and the burning of the Niagara region on the American side of the river, but those were limited. The planning taking place for the coming campaign season had a focus on the naval warfare being waged on the Great Lakes. Both the British and the Americans were building ships to be used on Lake Ontario, and they were building bigger than they had ever before. Sloops, schooners, and brigs were the most common ships found in the navies that patrolled the Great Lakes. The ships under construction were slightly smaller than ships of the line and were true warships. Frigates. Both nations were building two. The British were first to get theirs completed, and they were eager to get them out onto the lake before the Americans could get theirs out. And this was for two reasons. The first was the belief that the Americans would have better ships than the British. The second was a plan being devised by the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, Lieutenant General Gordon Drummond. Drummond drew up the plan to launch, once again, an attack on Sackett's Harbor across the lake from Kingston and the primary American base in the region. He presented it to the commander of the naval forces, Commodore James Lucas Yeo, and he was in agreement with the plan. Timing was key, as the Americans had moved all but 1,000 troops from Sackett's Harbor down to the Niagara region after the campaign by Phineas Riall in the December of 1813 that left nothing but embers of nearly every building on the U.S. side of the Niagara River. The plan was presented to Governor General George Prevost, as they would need a sizable complement of troops for the attack to be a success. The request for troops, though, would be denied by Prevost, and this denial may have been fueled by ego instead of strategy. Prevost had personally commanded the ill-fated attempt to capture Sackett's Harbor in the spring of 1813, with the failure largely being heaped on Prevost for ordering a retreat just as the British were gaining the upper hand. With Sackett's Harbor out of the picture, Drummond and Yeo looked for other opportunities to use the frigates to gain that upper hand before the Americans could get their frigates into the water. They looked now at Fort Ontario, also known as Fort Oswego. The fort was at the mouth of the Oswego River, where it flows into Lake Ontario. Originally a British fort constructed during the 7 Years' War, it was now a staging point on the supply route between the rest of New York and Sackett's Harbor. Supplies would be ferried up to Oswego and then transported by boat across Lake Ontario to Sackett's Harbor, eliminating the need for the longer, tedious overland routes. Having this fort taken from the Americans would put a real damper on their war effort, so timing was important. Intelligence collected said there was just shy of 300 American soldiers stationed there. As well, the cannon that would be used on the frigates under construction at Sackett's Harbor were there, waiting to be sent across the lake. Capturing those guns would all but ensure the British superiority on the waters. The landing force would crowd into the ships under the command of Commodore Yeo on the morning of May 3rd, and they would set off from Kingston to Oswego. The British had 400 Marines and 550 soldiers, with bateaux to be used as landing craft being towed behind the schooners and the 2 frigates. They would be sighted by the American lookouts at Fort Ontario on May 5th. The Americans hurried to prepare their defenses. The British, though, would not land that morning. Weather complicated the plans. It was rough enough to prevent the warships from being able to get into position to provide artillery support for the landing force. The British pulled back and spent the night at sea before attempting again the next day. At 6 a.m. on May 6th, the British soldiers loaded onto the landing craft, and the landing, led by Lieutenant Colonel Victory Fisher, commanding officer of the Regiment de Watteville, started at 11 a.m. The 2nd Battalion of the Royal Marines, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Malcolm, a company of the Glengarry Light Infantry under the command of Captain Alexander McMillan, and a company of the Regiment de Watteville, along with 200 sailors, greatly outnumbered the Americans who were tasked with protecting the fort. Now defending the fort, under the command of Major George Mitchell, were 242 men from the regular army, all of the 3rd Regiment of Artillery, along with 25 sailors and around 200 militiamen. As the men started to head towards the shores, the warships opened fire, with the frigates bringing their fire onto the fort itself, while escort ships that had joined the task force shelling the landing beaches to clear a way for the troops. The British would disembark from the landing craft in deeper water than intended. This would prove to be a very big issue for the men as they reached the shore. The water all but ruined their powder, which meant that they wouldn't be able to fire their muskets. The order was given to fix bayonets. The battle would need to be won the hard way. The Glengarry Light Infantry went to the woods to the east of the landing site, while the sailors, who were armed with pikes, went to the town of Oswego itself. The rest of the men launched an assault on the fort. The British rushed forward, undeterred by the volleys of musket fire from the Americans. They continued on despite mounting casualties. Meanwhile, the sailors rushed through the village, aiming to get to the cannon. With just their pikes and cutlasses, they were able to overpower the gunners, despite their commanding officer, Captain William Mulcaster, being taken out of action after being shot in the leg. The commanding officer of the American forces, Major Mitchell, realized further efforts were futile, and he sounded the retreat. The Americans would be falling back to Fredericksburg. Before they did, however, they did their best to prevent the capture of their colors, which were still flying above the fort. One of the British soldiers scaled the flagpole, trying to take down the flag that flew. He would get hit by musket fire, but continued anyway, ripping the flag down and letting it flutter to the ground below him to the cheers of the British forces. The raid on Fort Ontario was a victory for the British. The British casualties were comparatively light for an amphibious landing. The report from the Army indicated that there were 18 men killed and 69 wounded, while the Navy's report from the engagement was 17 men killed and 63 wounded. As for the Americans, the report indicated that there were 6 men killed, 38 wounded, and 25 missing. The report from Drummond de Prevost stated that the British had taken around 60 men prisoner, half of them severely wounded. Fort Ontario was now in British control, along with all the items within it. The British seized a few schooners, including the USS Growler. The cargo of the Growler was the key prize. It had 7 of the cannons that were destined for the frigates being constructed at Sackett's Harbor. Not all of the guns destined for Sackett's Harbor were there, though. They were still coming up the river to Oswego. This left the decision for Yeo: sail up the river to intercept the boats carrying the cannons, or set up a blockade to capture them when they came out onto the lake. Yeo opted to set up the blockade. On May 28th, the Americans made the decision to try to make the run. They had 19 bateaux carrying the guns, along with escorts that were along the shores. The commanding officer of the flotilla, Melanchthon Wolseley, pulled into Sandy Creek to wait for reinforcements. The next morning, the British found the Americans and captured one of the bateaux, and that crew betrayed the whole operation. The British had their chance to get the guns they missed earlier in the month. 3 gunboats and 4 smaller craft, along with Marines, were on the prowl, looking for the Americans. And then on the morning of May 30th, the masts were sighted in Sandy Creek, and the British moved in. What they didn't realize was the size of the escort. The commanding officer of the British force, Commander Stephen Popham, took the boats into the creek, where they came under fire from artillery and the men along the creek's shores. Marines were landed on both sides of the creek, but came under fire that was overwhelming. A retreat was ordered, but the British were already surrounded. With 17 men dead and another 50 wounded, Popham surrendered. The cannons were able to get to Sackett's Harbor, where they were fitted onto the USS Superior. While all of this was happening, the Americans were consolidating their gains from the summer of 1813 on Lake Erie. After the Battle of Lake Erie, the Americans controlled that body of water. This meant the troops who were stationed at Presque Isle could be redeployed, and the decision was made to ferry them to Buffalo in the spring of 1814 for an offensive that was being planned across the Niagara River. 2 officers, Captain Arthur Sinclair of the Navy and Lieutenant Colonel John Campbell of the Army, drew up a plan to raid some of the towns along the shores of Lake Erie in Upper Canada. On May 13th, with around 700 men under the command of Campbell, the plan was put into action. The Americans were also accompanied by Abraham Markle, a Canadian who had sided with the Americans, and also had a grudge, which was part of the reason why the target of the raid was selected. The next day, the Americans landed at Port Dover, where they would exchange fire with some Canadian militia who just happened to be there at the time. The Americans pulled back to the shore and prepared for a larger engagement. As it was easily deduced, the militia would get reinforcements to push the Americans back into the water. The next morning, the Americans assembled, took up positions with lines of battle, and found there was no opposition. The original plan for the Americans had been to burn the flour mills in Port Dover to deprive the British from being able to use them. Campbell ordered for all of the properties in the village to be burned. 20 houses, flour mills, sawmills, distilleries, and more. The livestock all slaughtered, and the carcasses left to rot. But, on the bright side, there was no looting. Aside from the homes, nearly everything else that was burned belonged to Robert Nicol. Nicol was a member of the Legislative Assembly of Upper Canada, and was the Quartermaster General for the militia. He was also the member of the Assembly who introduced the motion to expel Markle from the Assembly after he was charged with treason in 1813. The actions of Campbell enraged not just the British, but the Americans. Campbell stated he did undertake these actions on his own, and did so in retaliation for Lewiston and Buffalo, which had been burned to the ground the previous winter. Formal letter of protest written from the British, with Major General Phineas Riall, the man responsible for the burning of Niagara, writing it himself. Sinclair was also outraged at the actions of Campbell, as the destruction of the village was not part of the American plan. On June 20th, a court of inquiry was held, with Brigadier General Winfield Scott presiding. The court determined the burning of the mills was justified. However, the rest of Campbell's actions were not. Before they could determine what punishments would be enacted, Campbell was mortally wounded at the Battle of Chippewa on July 5th. The British laid out in clear words what they would be doing as a result of the burning of Port Dover. Governor General George Prevost wrote to Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane, the commander of the North American Station of the Royal Navy. In consequence of the late disgraceful conduct of the American troops in the wanton destruction of private property on the north shores of Lake Erie, in order that if the war with the United States continues, you may, should you judge it advisable, assist in inflicting that measure of retaliation which shall deter the enemy from a repetition of similar outrages. Cochrane then himself passed a note on to the Secretary of the Admiralty in London. I am most decidedly of opinion that the readiest way to attain this object is to bring home to the supporters of the government, which authorizes this unnatural system of warfare, a full share of its dreadful calamities, and to this end I have issued to the commanding officer of His Majesty's blockading squadron an order, accompanied by a secret memorandum. Whereas it appears that the American troops in Upper Canada have committed the most wanton and unjustifiable outrages on the unoffending inhabitants by burning their mills and houses, and by a general devastation of private property, you are hereby required and directed to destroy and lay waste such towns and districts as you may find assailable. You will hold strictly in view the conduct of the American army towards His Majesty's unoffending Canadian subjects, and you will spare merely the lives of the unarmed inhabitants of the United States. The British were committing themselves to total war. The British were also about to receive a significant reinforcement. In Europe, the British and their allies had defeated the French under the command of Napoleon Bonaparte. The Treaty of Paris was signed on May 30th, and that day, British soldiers who had been fighting in France were sent to Bordeaux to load onto ships destined for North America. There were 15,000 men, veterans who had faced some of the harshest combat conditions of the past 50 years and commanded by some of the top officers in the British Army. The Americans were to win the war. They would need to do something to prepare for the massive shift in momentum that was coming. John Armstrong Jr., the American Secretary of War, realized the military was in poor shape. The officers were at best incompetent. There was no training of the soldiers. It was the exact opposite of a trained and well-regulated militia. He looked to Winfield Scott to change things up. Scott was in Buffalo, where he would set up a camp of instruction to bring the Army up to standards that could be on par with the British regulars. How he did this was drastically different than anything the Americans had ever done before. The French Revolutionary Army's manual was used as a source. Men were drilled for 10 hours a day, with inefficient officers purged. That includes those who were political appointments. Camp hygiene and discipline were improved, which helped to reduce men who were on the sick roll and also helped to improve morale. The men who went through the camp of instruction were also given a different uniform than the rest of the army. Thanks to a lack of material, they were given gray uniforms instead of blue ones like the other regular soldiers. Scott was creating a functional army, and the Americans were set to go on the offensive before British reinforcements could arrive. And so our journey through this chapter of the War of 1812 ends. In our next episode, we will look at the battles that proved the American Army was a bona fide professional fighting force. Thank you for traveling alongside me. If these stories sparked a question, a memory, or just a newfound fascination, let's keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more hidden histories, and give us a like if you enjoyed the ride. Thank you for listening to Canadian History with Stephen Wilson.